and it is an honor to be here, and we have a great panel for you. And as he pointed out, in the long-standing tradition of saving the very best till last, here is the group. The world changes, it changes fast. I was a student here in 2000. I drove by what was supposed to be my old neighborhood, 512 Forbes area, and where my little Smurf Village house used to stand, there is an electric transformer and some blocks. That is about all that's left. For 3 years, I taught mill art at West Point, so I recognize what your faces look like, just on the verge of sleep, but we'll try to fix that. We'll try to fix that as we go. Today's panel, we have Josh Landis. He'll blow the Middle East and the Levant up and talk about what he calls the great sorting out, which is a very interesting theory. Then we'll be followed by Shibli Talhami, and he will examine the lack of international mechanisms that can address and fix what Josh is going to blow apart. And then finally, Bob Lamb, who is here at SSI, will take a look at how the U.S. trains and equips, our training and equip paradigm, building partner capacity, and the problem of sometimes you're building partner capacity with people that don't share your strategic goals and objectives, and what happens as that rolls on. So without further ado, Josh.
Well, it's a pleasure being here, and thank you very much for inviting me. I want to compare what's happening in the Levant. The Levant, of course, as you all know, is Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Jordan. Those states, multi-ethnic, multi-religious states, are very similar to the nation-building process that's going on there is very similar, I believe, to the process that took place in Central Europe that you're probably much more familiar with, maybe. Why is this comparison important? Because all of the nation-states of Central Europe and the Levant are the class of 1919, the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I, the great empire-destroying war. At this peace conference, they built new nation-states out of the Russian Empire that had been destroyed, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, and of course, for our purposes, the Ottoman Empire. Those states in Central Europe were like the Levant states, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. Poland, 64% Polish before World War II. By the end of World War II, 100% Polish. All of the minorities, the German minorities, others, Rutheni and so forth, Jews, of course, as you know, destroyed. Czechoslovakia, 32% minorities, the Sudeten Germans and so forth, all of them wiped out by the end of the war. And even then, Czechoslovakia couldn't stay together, and the Czechs and Slovaks had to separate, 1990s. And that is true right down Central Europe. Nation-building process, long and bloody. The idea that you could draw circles around all these different people and expect them to form a national cohesive identity and get along didn't work. And it led to this great sorting out, where the borders didn't change. The people were moved around. And it was long and bloody, and we know, as in Central Europe, tens of millions of people killed or displaced. 12 million Germans alone were ethnically cleansed from Central Europe at the end of the war. Even a little place like Crimea, which we've heard about so much recently, 6% German. Hitler occupied it, used those Germans as a collaborative elite. When Stalin retook it, all of them killed or fled the country. And that happened, of course, the Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia, 3 million, all gone. Polish Germans, gone. Hungary. So this process, which is only ending today in Europe, maybe it's ending. Of course, Yugoslavia, 1990, one country into 7 nations. Ukraine, today, perhaps splitting up to Russians and so forth. This great sorting out has been accomplished largely in Central Europe. Let's look at the Levant. A little bit different dynamic, although multi-religious, multi-ethnic. But the colonial powers, the British and the French, of course, had Lebanon, Syria, the British, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine. They helped minorities. They gave minorities a leg up in order to help them rule over the Sunni majority in some countries. And when they left at the end of World War II, minorities took power in every single Levantine country. The Arab Spring is the latest issue of this popular uprising of the majorities in each of these countries trying to take power for themselves, self-determination, and launching what I think we see as a great sorting out. This, of course, is going to have important policy implications for what is America trying to do in the region. If we look at Lebanon, the Maronite Christians, the Christians in general, but the Maronite Christians were given a lion's share of power by the French when they left. The last census ever taken in Lebanon, 1932. Why? Because that census gave 51% to the Christians. They've never been in a majority since then, and there's never been another census. When the French left in 46, they left a Christian president, a Christian chief of staff, and 6 out of every 11 parliamentarians were Christian. The Christians had a lock. The Muslims began demanding one vote, one man, one vote, almost immediately, because they were the majority and they knew they could take down the Christians by demanding it. Civil War, 1975, 15 years, long and bloody, 150,000 dead out of a country of less than 3 million. Very big proportions. And it's still probably not over. Now that there's 1 million new Syrian refugees, mostly Sunni, coming in, they're completely going to upturn that apple cart of the third, this delicate balance. Let's take Iraq. Of course, we know Iraq much better than the other countries today. 20% Sunnis, locked in by the British. Saddam's a Sunni. The Ba'ath Party is an institution for locking in Sunni power, as is the Iraqi army, all dominated by Sunni officers and Sunnis at the top. America sweeps in 2003 and essentially scrapes off the Sunnis off the top of society and casts them down to the bottom. Catapults the Shiites, 60%, from the bottom to the top in the name of democracy. Of course, the Sunnis don't like it. It's a zero-sum game for minorities. They see themselves, they've been fighting a rearguard action ever since, joining al-Qaeda and then subsequently ISIS in order to try to get back a hunk of that state. We could even take little Anatolia in Turkey, goes through a similar process. 20% of Anatolia, today's Turkey, were Christians in 1914. By the end of the nation-building process, the Ataturk's Kemalist revolution, First World War, and 1922, less than 1%. Today, there's less than 1% Christians. Long and bloody. Palestine. You can even shoehorn Palestine into this model. The Jews, 1850, are 4% of Palestine. By 1914, they're 17%, 14, 15, 16%, something in there. By the time the British leave in 1948, they're a third, 33% of the population. Of course, the Palestinians think, as soon as the British leave, we can dominate. We're going to win, we're the majority, so forth. They lose terribly. 2/3 of the Palestinian population is driven out of the country, loses their citizenship, not allowed back in. The Jews of Palestine, of Israel, do something that no other minority has been able to do, which is turn themselves into a majority. They can solve their minoritarian problem by becoming the minority, and the Palestinians become the losers. Zero-sum game. Of course, for 50 years, they've been trying to get back a little hunk of that land, long and bloody. Probably won't get it. Who knows? Maybe they will. That leaves us with Syria. The Alawites, 12% heterodox Shiites. They join the army that the French create in droves. They're the bottom of society, the dirt farmers of Syria. And they, by 1955, we believe that 65% of the non-commissioned officers were Alawites. A series of coups had helped them up. And then by 1970, Assad takes power, Alawite, and he builds a regime loaded with Alawites on traditional loyalties. His brother is the head of the Republican Guard, in-law, head of intelligence, and so forth. Then the Alawites, 70% of the officer corps, Alawite, we believe. So he's locked up the upper ranks to protect him. Unlike Mubarak in Egypt or Ben Ali in Tunisia, who let their children go into international banking to get rich. Assad sent their kids into the military. They knew what was coming. They were preparing for the day that the majority rose up, because they'd already done it in '82 in Hama. They knew what was going to come. And they were prepared. Not really, but the military did not abandon them, because the military was a reflection of the president, all based on loyalty. So we end up with this terrible struggle. Today, in Syria, nationalism terribly degraded. All of the major militias that have any writ from north to south of the country are Islamist militias. ISIS owns 1/3 of the territory in Syria. Nusra, Al-Qaeda, owns perhaps 6-7% of the country. The Islamic Front, that shares power with Nusra in most of the rebel areas, also flies the black flag of Islam, la ilaha illallah. None of those fly the Syrian national flag. Assad flies the Syrian national flag. Nationalism is dead, the Syrian nation. Islam is the glue. Now, America rejects that glue. Of course, our policy has been to find clan leaders and try to turn them into rulers of all of Syria. It's not going to work, because nobody wants them. They don't have an ideology. They want arms. And they say they'll kill everybody else. We won't work with the ideologies that are there. So where does that leave us? Let me go to my 3 policy implications of this great sorting out, I think, in that a religious identity has become the new identity. And ethnic. Kurds, of course, are the ethnic identity. And Syria, like Iraq, is splitting up into these different identities, and everybody sees it as, the minorities see it as a zero-sum game. The Christians have been wiped out of Iraq, so have the Yazidis, and a number of other smaller minorities. They're gone. It's already been. The Jews of Iraq, the Jews were the single largest religious community in Baghdad in 1914. They've all been sorted out from the Levant, and they've gone to Palestine, Israel, where they've kicked out the Palestinians. So they've been sorted out. The Jews are gone from the Middle East, like most of the other minorities. Now, the Alawites are clinging on. They don't want to be like the Christians of Turkey or the Sunnis of Iraq. And they're fighting. What can America do? First, America cannot adjudicate this kind of war any more than we could keep the Czechs and Slovaks together, or the Jews as part of Poland. We went into Iraq talking our talking points. Democracy, power sharing, human rights, all of that turned out to be fairly useless. Power sharing didn't work, because we were trying to build an Iraqi nationalism that had crumbled, that we could put it together and rebuild Iraqi nationalism, as we're trying to do with Syria. Our entire policy is predicated on political solution, power sharing, a transitional regime, so forth. Unlikely to work. What is the number 2? Islamism. I've already talked about this. Islamism has become the dominant ideology, and we're not willing to work with it. We want people to believe in John Locke and Hume, but they don't know about John Locke and Hume, and they're not going to believe in it, at least not in the short term. And 3, finally, this sort of situation of the great sorting out is going to come up on your radars, the U.S. military's radar, more and more. Not just in the Middle East. Of course, the Middle East is a casualty of the new pressures that are going on in the world. But most nation states came into existence and got their independence since World War II. Between World War II and 1973, 100 nation states got independence and joined the UN. There's 193 in the UN. There's been a herd of them after that. They're very young. They don't really know their borders. They're divided inside. Think Congo, think Nigeria, think Central African Republic. They're going to explode at some point under this terrible economic pressure. Because just the way that the American body politic is seen as giant income gap, separate the loser Americans, the Americans without skills, and those who are getting skills, and this giant income gap, the international community is separating The winner countries who have good government can have growth figures at 7 or 8%, like India, China, Turkey, Brazil, the BRIC countries, South Africa. They are bringing their populations into a firm middle class. But the loser regions, like the Middle East, like Africa, have very low growth rates. Their population's out of control. Their environmental degradation, no water. And they are crumbling. And as they crumble, these nations are the wheels will fall off, and you're going to get this sorting out as the dominant groups try to control. And the American military is going to be called in to fix them, like Yemen, like Assyria, like Iraq, like Afghanistan, or Libya. Everybody in Washington is going to say, where are you, President? You're a feckless, bad leader. You should be fixing this. And that's the question. Can America fix these sorts of questions? I've tried to draw a picture of what I believe is part of a nation-building process that is very difficult to adjudicate with military powder. You can do it, as we did in Iraq, but it costs you $1 trillion and 10 years, and it's going to be a lot more than 10 years. We've just learned that. And it just takes a hell of a lot of money to rebuild governments. We're good at destroying countries like Libya, Syria, Iraq, very bad at rebuilding them. Thank you.
Well, not only do we seem short on the American Army fixing these things in the short term, Shibli, I guess you can dive in here and tell us why there's no international way to do it.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. It's an honor for me to be here. I think one place to start is really where Joshua ended, in part because I think the picture he depicted is reasonably accurate in terms of what we're facing now. There's no question that sectarianism has become the norm in much of the region and certainly the countries he described, and in some cases religious and Islamist groups. Where I think I would start, though, is not there, because I don't think that's the reason we have failed states. Sectarianism is not the reasons we have failed states. It is the outcome of failed states. And I tell you this because if I look at any of the groups that have been described, whether it's Shia or Sunni, Alawi, Christians, Kurds, Jews, if you look at the region, these differences existed in the region throughout history. Look at the Sunni-Shia divide that goes back to the origins of Islam. It's not that these are new divisions that we're now living with. So you have to ask the question, when do these divisions and these identities rise to the top of people's priorities? A Shia is not only a Shia. A Shia is an Iraqi or a Saudi and an Arab and a citizen of the world and a professional and a military commander and a father. And so the fact that one is described as a Shia doesn't tell you something about what is their priority. They have multiple identity, we all do. A Christian Palestinian feels more a Palestinian than a Christian, or more an Arab than a Christian. We actually test that. So the reality of it then is it's not sufficient to just look at those ethnic groupings and say they rise to the top. They rise to the top when there is already a collapse of state and when there is no national identity to encompass that. So in my own judgment, the first conclusion here isn't that sectarianism is hopeless, but rather than to prevent it from rising to the top, you need to preserve state entities. And I think what we're facing, we have to look at what it is that we're facing. If you look at a country like Egypt, where we don't have major ethnic diversity. There are 10% Christians, but there's practically no Shia in Egypt, very, very few. And yet look at how divided Egypt is. Unfortunately, it's not a civil war, and I hope it never gets into it. But look at the secular religious divide, if you want to call it that is emerging. You don't need ethnicity. You don't need those divisions to have the kind of challenges that states are facing. So it's not the source of the problem. It's the one where I want to start. And then what is the source of the problem? So if I look at the the events that are unfolding in the Middle East, particularly over the past decade, it starts with one big dissolution of a state, and that is Iraq. That dissolution of the state of Iraq, following the 2003 war, has had consequences that we're still living with. ISIS would not have emerged in the Middle East at the core, even in the way that is interacting with Syria, if it weren't for the fact that the collapse of central authority made it possible for these groups to come there. The collapse of central identity, of Iraqi identity and Arab national identity, certainly empowered sectarianism, even people who don't want to rally behind their sects. So the Iraq issue, first of all, is substantial, but it's not the whole story. The second part of the story is what I call the public empowerment on a scale we had never seen before. I think that the Arab uprisings weren't the traditional uprisings that you typically have. I think they're profoundly different. And here's why I think they're profoundly different. They're enabled by an information revolution that has led to increased expectations, increased ability of interaction across borders and across groups. And it poses certain challenges to central authority in ways we had never seen before. And that's not going to go away. But the very fact that you have that empowerment means that that is going to increase divisions within society, not decrease it. Because in a place like Egypt, you're going to have the ultra-Salafis empowered, and you're going to have the liberals empowered, and you're going to have the Christians empowered, and you're going to have the rich and the poor empowered. So this public empowerment that occurred out of this information revolution is empowering, but the empowerment in the short term in the competition for power with a weakened central authority leads to more divisions and confrontations, not to, regardless of whether it's sectarian or not to harmony. And when you add to it that from the point of view of the international community, just put aside the United States. Obviously, we are a leader of the international community and have taken a lead in a number of cases. But as a group, as the big powers, to just be specific, if you look at how the big powers have dealt with troubles across history, the whole idea of sovereignty wasn't really an idea about a sovereign is going to be benign to its people. That wasn't even part of the equation. It was essentially a bargain between the international community and rulers. You keep the international community out of trouble, and we will just give you the authority to do what you want at home. And that's why we overlooked a lot of things. This is the sovereign deal that we have, the international community has made with states. I submit to you that two things happened over the past half a century the international community has not adapted to. One of which is obviously the fact that we have transnational actors that have it kind of become more difficult to control even when you make deals with rulers. And that obviously is a different kind of threat that we have to deal with and we have to deal with in the Middle East. But even more than that, I would argue that we have had remarkable change in public expectations of the big powers, including here in the US. In the way, for example, when you look at when Assad, the father, Hafiz Assad, killed tens of thousands of his people in 1982, the pictures were not there on TV. People hardly knew about them. There was no public pressure related to it. When Bashar Assad does a bombing and 500 people get killed, that's on our TV screen. And it does increase the expectation to break away from the bargain, the historical bargain of its exchange, keep the international community out, we will overlook what you're doing at home. That has changed. There's a lot of pressure not to go with it. And I think with it has arisen a doctrine that challenged the old view that stability is a good thing. We used to say stability is a good thing for that reason, basically keeping the international community out of trouble. And I think we've seen in the past, certainly with the Arab uprisings, and maybe before, right after the Iraq War, the initial idea that we need to change regimes and try to change the mix of, or the bargain between the rulers and their people. And I think we're going back, in a way, to this stability argument. You find here, by the way, in a public polling that I do in the United States, the most recent one I did here among the American public, a national representative sample, when I asked the public, when you look at foreign policy decisions of the United States, what is your opinion motivated by? America's national interests, international law, human rights. The number one answer is human rights. I had a quarter of the American public and 1/3 of the Democrats say human rights is the single most important priority in looking at foreign policy. Another 59% say, another 31% say it's among the top 3. And so what I'm suggesting here is that there's expectations, and those expectations have not been matched by an evolution of the international institutions to meet them. So there are different public expectations that putting different political pressures on leaders across the big powers, including in the US, and there is not a mechanism to understand or even deal with them, as we discovered when we go into Iraq and trying to nation build. I think there's a gap. We don't have an answer. And it's not because the international community is unwilling to intervene. In my opinion, there has actually been too much intervention. And let me give you an example. In all of the cases that we're talking about, Iraq is obvious. I mean, Iraq comes direct consequence of a military intervention from the outside. Look at Libya. Obviously, the outcome in Libya that we're facing now is out of not just an intervention, but a multilateral intervention, in fact, approved by the Security Council. And look at the result. Look at what we see in Syria. Yes, we don't have a direct UN intervention in Syria, but we have a coalition on the American side. And beyond that, look at how many countries are intervening in a big way. The Gulf states have been spending enormous amounts of money to support the opposition against Assad, and more than that. Look at the Iranians have been backing the Assad regime. The Russians have been backing the Assad regimes. The Hezbollah is intervening. So there's an enormous amount of intervention. It's not that we don't have intervention. And look at even places where we think there isn't all that much intervention, like Egypt. But look at what happened in Egypt. First, Morsi was kept solvent economically by an infusion of billions from Qatar. Sisi is being kept, by tens of billions that are coming from the Gulf states. So people are intervening in a big way, whether economically or politically, in every one of these cases. So there's a huge investment. And now, obviously, look at what's happening in Yemen, where you have a coalition of Arab forces and Muslim forces intervening in Yemen to change the outcome. So it's not as if we don't have a will to intervene, or that the international community isn't expending a lot of energy and money on intervention. It is that they're doing it in a competitive way, not in a harmonious way most often, and they're not doing it right because the challenges that are being faced, like the ones in Yemen, in the end, they're not challenges that could be solved militarily, but they require more of a political and economic solution, the likes of which requires a different kind of institution that is still missing in the international community. I'll end with that.
I think that last couple paragraphs is a perfect segue to you.
Thanks very much. And thanks for having me here today. So back in around 2006, 2007, I worked in OSD strategy. And I was the Stuckey on the Ungoverned Areas project. I managed that for about 2 years and wrote the final report. Some of you might have read it, most likely not. The first recommendation was, for the love of God, please stop using the word ungoverned. It tends to put this mental image in your head that if the capital doesn't control some part of the country, that there's no governance happening out there, and it makes us lazy. when what we should be doing is looking at how places that are not controlled by the central government are actually governed. So that was the first recommendation that I always have to, my name is associated with this term ungoverned as an unfortunate result of my having managed it. And I've had a number of people criticize me for my views without actually having read that I actually oppose the concept. But the larger project was embedded in some concerns about capacity building. You know, how do you build partner capacity to deal with governance issues in conflicted countries? And I had a lot to say about that, but one of the big recommendations was don't build the capacity of people who don't share your objectives. And it's you know, that seems an obvious thing to say, but when you look at the history of it, and you know, it turns out we're building a capacity of someone we thought was our partner, and it turns out they use that capacity in ways that we didn't entirely expect. You can see that it's important to point that out. Some years later, and a good bit of further research suggests that really there was a prior recommendation that I should have made in that report, which is find out what their objectives are. Really do a good study of what's the political economy, what are the motivations, what are the incentives that they're facing within their own countries, rather than just focusing on the objective that we have in a place. We build their capacity to help us, you know, check that box. Well, maybe they check that box, maybe they don't, but they have their own boxes to check. And now we've built capacity that they're going to use in ways that might perhaps be unexpected. What I want to talk about is some of the capacity that we've built in the Middle East, North Africa region. There's a pattern. Stephen Walt in his foreign policy column back in January had a fun little column called "If Only We Had Spilled More Blood and Treasure in Yemen," or something along those lines. And he observed a pattern in which the United States sees a country that we don't think is particularly well governed, and for whatever reason, we would prefer that they would not be the regime in power. And so we back some other force in that country, we arm them, we train them, we equip them. And then it turns out that those people who we're backing have their own interests, their own priorities, their own objectives. And the result is often quite different from what we had expected. And so this has happened in Afghanistan and in Libya, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, all in the past 15, 20 years. So the idea that there's somebody we don't like, we're going to arm and train and equip someone that we do like in the hopes of getting rid of them and our problems will be solved, has been repeatedly shown to be sort of wishful thinking. Now there's the other side of that, which is there are also a good number of authoritarian regimes that we have backed, you know, because there's some strategic interests that we have, or there's access to strategic resources that we find important, or because of terrorism or whatever. And then there's an awkward period comes when there are some people within that country who are demonstrating and say, well, maybe there should be some democratic reforms in this country. And then we're in the awkward position of, well, do we continue to back this authoritarian regime against those opponents and betray our democratic values? Or do we, you know, like we have with Mubarak and Maliki, ask them to step aside and deal with the consequences there, the consequences being often, again, unexpected, and perhaps opening the doors to instability. So there's second-degree consequences to everything that we do that we're not always as sensitive to as we should be. A couple years ago, we did a study of with Nadia Shadlow called Potential Transitions. So these were politically significant demonstrations, coups and coup attempts, and internal wars worldwide between 1989 and 2010. And we were interested to know how the United States responded to these potential regime change events. This is before it was clear whether these were going to succeed and result in regime changes or not. And that's the policy situation that policymakers face. Do we intervene? Do we not intervene? And we tracked about 400 events between 1989 and 2010. and 25 different variables for how the United States responded to them, everything from do absolutely nothing through diplomatic, all the way up through unilateral military occupation. There's a couple of interesting findings there, namely that in fully 50% of the events in the data set, the United States did literally nothing. In 80% of them, we did either nothing or we made some kind of a public statement of some sort. And only 20% did we try to affect the outcome. Almost all of those were through civilian efforts, primarily. All of the military interventions were all preceded by civilian interventions, with the exception of a couple. We had to take an airport in the Philippines and that sort of thing. In contrast to the idea that the United States intervenes a whole lot, in fact, we only intervene in the sense of trying to affect the outcome of a crisis in about 20%. However, that 20% is still an average of every 10 weeks. So an average of every 10 weeks between 1989 and 2010, the United States made a policy decision to try to affect the outcome of some foreign internal crisis, which kind of gives you a sense of the scale of activity that the United States engages in. So we did we sampled a subset of this data set to look just at the crises that happened in the Middle East and North Africa region. But then we also, this is in 2013, so we also added 2011 and 2012. And we came up with a total of 20 potential transitions in that 1989 to 2012 year. I won't list them all because there's 20 and we want to get to questions. I'll just note that Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003 are not included in that list. Afghanistan because it was ongoing at the end of the study period. Iraq because we were studying potential transitions, not transitions that we initiated. So we did not respond at all to 30% of those 20 transitions. We did try to intervene in some way in 7 of them, either in civilian or military. 6 out of those 7 interventions in MENA were civilian-only efforts, high-level diplomacy, withdrawal of aid, that sort of thing. And then there was a military intervention in Iraq in the mid-90s and then Libya in 2011. Now, of course, subsequent to that, there's been significantly, I would say, more activity. One of the most, frankly, disturbing findings of that study was that we were entirely unable to define a success variable. As in, did the United States get what it wanted out of this intervention? And the reason we weren't even able to define that variable is because we weren't able to identify what the United States wanted out of these interventions. It was entirely unclear. Sometimes withdrawal of military assistance was meant to be symbolic rather than actually affect the outcome. We withdrew aid from froze some assistance to Bahrain, for example, a few years ago. That doesn't necessarily mean we wanted the demonstrators to overthrow Bahrain. And there are many, many examples of that. So we couldn't even necessarily say that the United States has gotten what we wanted out of it, but we did some qualitative analysis and found that it's kind of a coin toss whether the U.S. intervention actually promoted U.S. interests or not. So I think the implications of this set of research and other research I've done on security sector reform and that sort of thing suggest 2 things. One is, the 2 are expect blowback and let's try to avoid moral hazards. When you're going to intervene in the Middle East in somehow, whether it's civilian only, high-level diplomacy, aid, withdrawal of aid, bombing, military support, refueling, and so on and so forth, we're frankly terrible at predicting what the second-order consequences of that are going to be. We are frankly terrible at understanding the internal politics and the internal dynamics. We're not particularly skilled at being able to say with confidence that the people who we're partnering with are actually going to be on our side. We often do get our way with our partners, but it's not we don't get our way consistently enough for us to be able to really confidently say that we can that we can protect our interests. Moreover, there's a moral hazard to being very active in this region. I think that the current administration is frankly doing a somewhat better job than its predecessor in that the current administration is not attempting large-scale social engineering with tens of thousands of troops on the ground and spending $1 trillion in the hopes of transforming societies. The current administration, I think, is taking a much more pragmatic approach. There's, in the media, you see some hand-wringing about, well, we're on Iran's side in Iraq and Syria, but we're against Iran and Yemen, and that's very confusing. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Strategy is the art of positioning yourself for advantage, and I frankly don't think that we should have permanent friendships in that part of the world. Especially with those countries that share so few of our values and interests. Where they overlap, yes. Where they don't, well, we go our own way. So I think the bottom line of this is I think we should recognize that, frankly, nobody in the Middle East is on our side. Everybody in the Middle East is on their own side. And people will say what they think we want to hear to get us to give them what they want. They'll try to co-opt us into fighting their battles for them. But by doing that, I think we are making ourselves the story where we shouldn't necessarily be the story. We, frankly, I think weaken our hand by being so involved, and we make ourselves more of a target. So to me, that says that we need to ask ourselves a lot more questions, be a lot more cautious, even more cautious than the current administration. Hopefully the next administration will be even more cautious about intervening. I would say, if I were to summarize the point I'm trying to make, I would say, do less.
Thank you. Real quick, show of hands, just to make sure we're all up. How many have had one or two or more tours in either Afghanistan or Iraq? Raise your hands. Yes, indeed.
Yeah,
yes, indeed.
that's
so,
impressive.
even if we intervene much less, it's going to probably be every 15 weeks, not every 10. And you will be the ones intervening, probably, most likely. I just want to hit a few highlights after our descent into darkness here. Just a couple lights. I was fortunate enough from about 2003 to 2005 to serve with Zalmay Khalilzadeh Barno and a wonderful station chief whose name will be not announced here in public in Afghanistan as the chief of staff for CFC Alpha. The bottom line is, no matter what happens, some of you in this room are going to wind up helping to write and frame the strategy based on the policy and send somebody, cut the orders and send them out. The guy sitting next to you is going to have to execute the damn order that you write. And oh, by the way, he'll be cursing your name the whole time he's out there doing it, most likely. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when you get into theater, you'll be plopped in with a country team, and then you'll learn all sorts of unique things about the country team. That we have more personnel in the military who play musical instruments than there are foreign service officers right now, about 5,000 of them, okay? You're going to get to an embassy, it's going to be undermanned. And as a military commander there, or some of you JTF commanders in the future, wherever you wind up as the military, you're going to own about 95% of the assets on the ground there, and the ambassador is going to be able to play with 5 to 7% of those assets, okay? Unless you're smart and you come together as a country team to execute the strategy. A couple things on Afghanistan in that period that made it, quite frankly, maybe take some insights from it. First, the international community. From the initial bond agreement, or the 5 states, nation states that were putting it all together, there were common goals and directions, okay, about what each of the roles and responsibilities us, the Germans, the Italians, and so on and so forth. We're going to do Japanese, DDR, so on and so forth. So defined roles and responsibilities as to what was going to happen. But at the same time, that doesn't really guarantee that you're going to have a common set of goals and objectives to which you can write a campaign plan for in theater and then move it back here through the interagency. We were very lucky. At the same time, General Barno and a guy by the name of Dave Sedney were there, and we were working with the staff to build a campaign plan. The senior representative for the UN, head of the UN, Secretary General, a guy by the name of Brahimi was in the country as well, and he said, they all agreed. The UN, then later on Jean Arnault, Barno, Zal-Khalilzad, and the Afghans themselves agreed that the strategic objective for 2003, 4, and 5 was going to be a political objective, and that was to set the conditions for the presidential and then subsequently the parliamentary elections 2004 and 2005. Everything else in the campaign plan, the coin strategy, the regional strategy for where we put great Americans like Gary Cheek and so on and so forth on the ground, was all part of the single strategy to set the conditions for the elections. And as the elections approached, it included the deployment of the 22nd MEU, so on and so forth. So there was a common framework and a strategy. And there was a guy in charge. And although there were other nations in charge, Zalmay Khalilzad will always tell you, the guy who's writing the checks makes the strategy. You know, he's going to execute it. As far as he was concerned, the Americans were writing the checks here, the bulk of the checks, and they would move things along. But the key to the success here was the triumvirate of the three guys, Zal, Dave Barno, general in charge, and the station chief, who would meet every morning at the embassy and iron out everything that was going to go on based on meetings Zal would have probably every other night with the president of the country, meetings that Dave Barno would have with Jean Arnault. We just were very fortunate that all of those people all at once got along. They knew what the strategic objective was, and it was going to roll out. We were very, very fortunate. So there's a common strategic goal on which you could write a coherent campaign plan with goals and objectives that kind of everybody kind of fiddled around with, and it all made sense, right down to what CJTF 76 and our Tropic Lightning folks are going to do on the ground. And what we found out very quickly is one of the pieces that we're very, very good at, i.e. we attempt to be good at, is building an army in our own image, you know, wherever we go, the Iraqi army and Afghan army. What we realized very quickly by about 2004 was, like politics, all security is local. And we needed to get a handle on the police. I think in talking to the two subsequent station chiefs and the military folks that were in Afghanistan, and I think a lot of folks that were in Iraq would say that the key piece that we need to be able to learn how to do as a nation, and this isn't a military task, it's a national task, is how do you go into a place and work on local security? And it has to do with policing, good policing in the local areas. We actually contracted militia in some places to get that done through elders, so you could secure the election process. But basically a series of concentric rings. Police, local police, the Afghan National Army, and then over the horizon, about 20 minutes away, the cavalry of the U.S. could come in and take care of issues. So as you're writing the plans and you're working through them, there are some first principles. Work with the international community if they are involved, and you got to have strategic goals and objectives. The grand strategy has to be framed. If you can write a campaign plan from there, more the better, and then think really closely about how you're going to take care of local security. And that shapes the society. The women get to teach the girls in school only if there's I will tell you, only if there's a soldier there or somebody there to make sure that the security of that school is going to be kept. There's no night letter the next night. There's something along those lines. It's kind of getting in the weeds, but basically the way that all kinds frames out. So the grand strategy, the country team, if you're the military JTF commander, there's probably a future one sitting here in the room. I know all of you will raise your hands. but you're here in the room. You're going to have to share those assets probably openly with your embassy counterpart, the ambassador, because he has no assets. The Afghan embassy, when I arrived there, was about half full. And it consisted, any State Department folks in here, real quick? There you are. It consisted at the time, and I want to be very honest, it consisted of very young people getting their start in the State Department and a set of folks that were doing the, what do they call that, the high three at the end of their career for the retirement. So you had folks who were learning, and you had folks on CPR, okay? And then basically you had to fill in the middle. You have to do that willingly to make it all work. So strategy, U.S. country team, and then really look at, is it an army or police we really need here? How do we take care of local security? I think if we think of those things and we make sure we have those things in the future, we can answer a lot of it. We can work with international partners, fix, and I'm not saying we fix broken states. Those are 50-year propositions in my view, but we can get at to some of the problems we were talking about here today, and that leaves us with a good set of time, okay, for questions, all right? So, I know it's the end of the day. There's barbecue waiting somewhere. You can smell the grills cooking as I came in, okay? Yeah. Okay, sir.
Lieutenant Colonel Tashkın from Turkey. My questions are about Syrian crisis and ISIS. After ISIS emerged, Syrian regime, Assad regime and Iran is trying to fight against ISIS. So will there be any rapprochement between United States and Assad regime and Iran for the sake of fighting against ISIS? The second one is, how did you see the rapprochement with PKK as another terrorist organization? And such kind of rapprochements and breaking apart of Syria and Iraq into 2 or 3 parts will cause some other problems, as seen in the title, will there be a forever war after these kind of rapprochements? Thank you.
Please start with you and then go to Jack.
The interesting thing about ISIS is that it has frightened not only certainly Iran and Iraq and the Assad regime, it has actually frightened the Sunni Arab states. And in that sense, it actually created a very unusual opportunity. One of the things that we see just in the past 2 days, when ISIS swept into the Palestinian refugee camp in Syria, Yarmouk, one of the large camps in Syria of Palestinian refugees that have been there since 1948. And they're pretty much have taken over, the reports say. Obviously it's hard to know for sure. But the PLO, which has been at odds with Assad throughout for a variety of reasons. PLO is Sunni, it receives its aid from Sunni countries. And even without that, they had a conflict with Assad dating back many years going. They just met with the Assad regime to strategize about how they can cooperate to retake Yarmouk. So it tells you something about how ISIS has really reshuffled in some ways the priorities. It's not just for Iran. And I could tell you here in the United States, I do polling here about how the American public sees ISIS. One of the questions I ask is, what is the biggest threat facing the United States today? And I include Iran. And I get 70% of the public say ISIS, and only 12% say Iran, and 13% Israel-Palestine. So that the sense of that ISIS is the biggest threat has, even for the American public, has lowered the sense of the Iranian threat and even the Assad regime threat. And I think for the administration particularly, whether or not the Iran deal will enable the United States to have to cooperate with Iran a little bit more. Obviously, there is cooperation, tacit cooperation with Iran ongoing now. And I think, I do not believe personally that given the timeline of this agreement and the incrementalism, that you're going to have a transformed relationship. I think it'll be a little bit easier to cooperate, and it'll be a little harder for Iran to go against the wishes of the coalition in the process of implementation coming out of sanctions. So yes, there'll be more cooperation, but not transformation. I think that in the end, even the Sunni governments that are not happy with Iran, are not happy with Assad, have been much more permissive of late. Now, the Saudis and the GCC states had taken a principled position against Assad, and that hasn't changed publicly yet. But if you consider that the Arab force, the joint Arab force that was just put together after the intervention in Yemen, that was announced in the Arab summit that took place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. If you consider that the two main partners in that coalition force are Egypt and Saudi Arabia, those are really and then a lot of other countries, but frankly, this is essentially a Saudi-Egyptian alliance broadened to look like an Arab arrangement. You have to look at it that way. And if you look at where Egypt is on Syria, Egypt, says it doesn't like Assad, but the Egyptians never believed that going after Assad is the way to go. And that certainly wasn't, I think that's the Saudi. And I think the Obama administration, as you know, a lot of advisors within the administration have said basically the red line should be don't break down the Syrian army, just like we did in Iraq. Because if the Syrian army collapses, ISIS, there's nothing between control of Syria and ISIS except the Syrian army. Well, if you don't go after the Syrian army, you don't go after Assad. And so, however we want to fudge it, that's a reality that's seeping in. There's a political problem with that because of the position that had been taken publicly before. But I think that when you take into account that there is a consensus that there is no moderate opposition that is capable to defeat both ISIS and Assad, where does that leave you?
Your question, of course, goes to the heart of the difficulties between Turkey and the United States. What is America's strategy for ISIS in Syria? We have a strategy for ISIS in Iraq, which seems very clear, which is to arm up the Shiites to dominate the Sunnis. Of course, we don't like it. We talk about power sharing. How can we bring the Sunnis in? But ultimately, we're giving a free hand to the Iraqi army, dominated by Shiites, and the militias. We don't like the militias, but that is a solution. We have partners in Iraq, the Peshmerga and the Iraqi government, which we built. In Syria, we don't. We are strategic allies with Assad, in a sense, because his enemies are ISIS and our enemies are ISIS. The trouble with this is we cannot do in Syria, what we did in Iraq, which is to get on the side of a sectarian Shiite regime and force our will on the Sunnis. We don't like Assad. Assad has killed too many people. He's the minority. The religious minorities in Syria add up with the Christians and the Druze and the Ismailis and the Alawites, all of whom support Assad more or less, are only 20%. You've got the Kurds that are 10%. Of course, we'll get to the Kurds. But the Arab Sunnis are 70% of Syria. America is not going to side with Assad. Even though we see him as a bulwark against ISIS, we're not going to side with him, because it would be too politically expensive for America to undermine its own ideology, which is democracy, power sharing, human rights. All those things would have to be thrown out the window. And Syria is not important to us. Iraq is important. Syria has no importance to the United States. So we would prefer to be against everybody in Syria, which is exactly our policy. The three major powers in Syria are Assad, who owns about 50%, 45% of the territory, but 65% of the people. We've got very strong sanctions on him, and we're arming and equipping, and we're helping rebels to kill his army. ISIS owns 35% of the territory. We're bombing them. Nusra, Al-Qaeda owns another 5 or 6 in the Islamic Front, which is with Nusra. 6 or 7% of the territory. We're against them. We're bombing them. That means every major power, authority that could possibly put Syria back together again, we're against them, and we're hurting them. This means Syria is going to fragment more and more, and the people are going to become refugees and go to your nice country and try to become Turks, because it'll be much better. But this means that America, in a sense, is against Turkey. Turkey wants, of course, to destroy Assad, and Erdogan has described the problem as ISIS is the inflammation. Assad is the virus, or the bacteria. You have to kill Assad so that the inflammation goes away. America doesn't believe this. America believes that if you kill Assad and you destroy the Syrian state, ISIS will spread, and Nusra will spread, and they'll take Damascus. It would be, and we have a failed state, you're going to get the spread of these radical militias. We will be terrified if ISIS and Nusra take Damascus. If Assad falls, they're the two likely powers that have the muscle to take Damascus. Already, ISIS just took the big Palestinian camp, which is 10 miles away from the presidential palace in southern Damascus. Nusra took Idlib in the north, major city. So that's already happening. America didn't complain about any of this. We have done nothing, which proves my theory that America cannot side with Assad, and yet we're bombing the others. But if they take it, we're not going to jump in and support Assad. It's too politically risky. That means Turkey does not have a partner in the United States, and America has no partner in Turkey. Turkey tried to use ISIS and Nusra to destroy the Kurds. America has tried to use the Kurds to destroy Nusra and ISIS. We have been diametrically opposed to each other on that policy. Erdogan has said we're not going to allow an independent Kurdish state in the north of Syria the way it happened in Iraq. And America has been supporting the Kurds in Kobani. And we forced Erdogan to back that policy because we were going to do it anyway. So this tension, I don't see how we're going to overcome it on the Syrian policy. We've said we're going to equip and build together, but we can't agree on what the objectives are. And that's really a big problem for our Syria policy. So we're going to contain Syria, try to keep the damage in, the violence in, do counterterrorism, but we don't have a solution for Syria because we don't have any partners. And that's the way I see the Syria policy.
Another question. I hear reveille in the background. Folding fast. Sir.
Andy Terrell, SSI, and I think I would kind of like to follow up on what Dr. Landis just said, because as I look at Syria and look back at the example of the 14, 15-year civil war in Lebanon and look at the current level of conflict, over 200,000 people killed, and try to envision some sort of eventually normal state in Syria, I have a real difficult time generating any kind of credible scenarios. Even if ISIS is gone 5 years from now, no longer exists, even if Assad no longer exists 5 years from now, I'm not certain that this war isn't going to go on in the indefinite future for decades. And I take no comfort in the fact that there might be some ideological affinity between various groups, because oftentimes ideological affinity just means that your ability to work together is lessened, not strengthened. The Tsar didn't kill Trotsky. So under these circumstances, I was hoping that people on the stage would tell me I'm too pessimistic and there is a way out. Thank you.
May I it actually links up to something I had wanted to say and I didn't have a chance to say. You may be right. I'm not going to say up front, I'm not necessarily going to give you an optimistic view because it's hard to. But I want to say that one way to look at the Syrian problem is that there is that part which is internal, the sort of stuff that Joshua described. And we know it's a complicated country, and now that central authority has been weakened, there are forces that have been unleashed that are just hard to see how they're going to come to an equilibrium on their own. There is that. But I submit to you that at least 50% of Syria's problem right now is competing foreign intervention, where Syria has become a strategic battleground for regional and international forces. And so obviously Iran and Saudi Arabia particularly, aiding different forces there. Certainly the neighboring state that have interest, Turkey, Jordan, Israel not so much a big player, but obviously Lebanon through Hezbollah, linked to Iran. And of course Russia and the United States. So I think one avenue, that you have here is that if you can reach some kind of international accommodation, there is a chance that at least if you can minimize the level of the counterproductive international intervention, you might be able to force a more realistic negotiation or at least accommodation inside. So the starting point for me is not to solve it internally, but externally. The starting point for me is to get the Saudis and the Iranians to reach some kind of understanding. For us with the Russians to reach some kind of understanding. That's my starting point, and we can on that. And that's possible for a variety of reasons. One reason it's possible is that while Joshua is right about saying Syria is less important to the U.S. than is Iraq, for sure. I mean, you can look at it in terms of the degree of commitment. But we worry not so much about Syria, but the spillover effect, such as into Lebanon, and such as into Jordan, and such as beyond that at some point. Obviously, even our justification for the intervention in Syria against ISIS is Iraqi security. Remember, that's what the president used to justify essentially intervening in Syria. So we need to have, there are dangers for the outside states that create incentives to prevent that spillover that a lot of people fear, and that's a common interest that can develop. So my starting point is, let's first try to reach a strategic accommodation, not go about it trying to alter unilaterally or even multilaterally the coalition on the ground, because that, as you suggested, is a losing enterprise. It's not going to happen on its own.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Russell King. I have a question about the ISIL videos. There are a lot of different themes to these videos. You know, you have ISIL shooting Egyptian Christians on the Libya coast. You have, beheadings of journalists. Also, I think there are ISIL videos executing Russian intelligence officers and executing members of the Assad regime. But I'm wondering, what do you think their propaganda purposes for this? Because I would think they would try to, for example, maybe force us to do some impetuous action that might not work very well. They're trying to provoke rage, trying to provoke religious conflict. What is their goal?
Anyone wants to start? Go for it. I don't know that any of us has a compelling theory because we all struggled with it. To the point where, on the one hand, look at the first time we faced these horrible beheadings. And by the way, you know that the American public that usually doesn't pay much attention to foreign policy, when the polling show over 90% of the American people has seen or heard reports about the beheadings. That's extraordinary. It tells you why they have, put ISIS up at the top. So on the one hand, when you look at ISIS and when it started, if you are looking at it as differentiated from Al-Qaeda in some way, obviously there are sort of offshoots, maybe with help from Saddam Hussein fighters, but still an offshoot ideologically from Al-Qaeda. But if you were going to say there's an ideological difference, here's the ideological difference. Al-Qaeda said, I don't like all these horrible regimes in the Arab world, including the Saudi regime, the Egyptian regime, just like ISIS says. But said the core problem is the United States, because without the United States, none of them would exist. They're being kept alive by the U.S., so let's go after the U.S. ISIS said ideologically completely different. Look at the rhetoric. Our focus is not now America. Obviously, America is a problem. But no, we're going to change first the regimes on the ground, in part because, of course, they're operating in Iraq and Syria, and they're going after those two regimes. So, but they talk as if they're not out there to provoke a confrontation with the United States. And yet, they do exactly what resulted in a confrontation with the United States. And so it seemed to go against, did they think they can frighten people to keep them out? Are they trying to frighten minorities to escape? I think they probably are. I think a lot of this thing is just pure fear and notoriety. Is this, oddly enough, it has taken away from Al-Qaeda's support. It seems to be people are, this just being in the news and looking like you're scaring everybody else is clearly creating recruits for them. But it's still, I have to admit, it's puzzling. It's not a very straightforward situation.
We speak with a lot of folks in D.C. who look at these as recruiting tools. And when you look at the demographic they go after, generally young men, these images of the ideology and out there doing dangerous, fun things is a lot more fun than sitting in Minneapolis playing your little video game. Come join us and join a cause that's transcendent to yourself, a larger cause you can join and glob onto. And they are effective recruiting tools for young people.
And the revenge. I think the revenge aspect. I mean, you look at some of the major films have had 5 minutes of blowing up American vehicles with Americans in them taken from Iraq. And they just show you 5 minutes of blowing up Americans. Then they go to do 5 minutes of Shiites. So you're taking on, if you're an aggrieved Sunni Arab, you're seeing somebody who's standing up for you and is getting the enemy and taking down the Americans and blowing them up, and they're doing it with exquisite beauty. So it's a revenge film. If anybody who's had a revenge fantasy, I don't know, maybe you guys don't do that kind of thing. But it would be very...
Only academics.
It would be very satisfying in a way. And then they go on to their other ideology and so forth. But that revenge aspect, and when you take the Japanese guy, for example, they demanded $200 million. Japan, just the week before, had donated $200 million to non-lethal aid to Iraq to kill al-Qaeda, to ISIS, to damage ISIS, to fight ISIS. They put the same amount of money. When they did the Jordanian burn-up, it was because Jordan had been bombing them and burning them. And they plowed out the rubble of a building they said Jordan had bombed, and they buried him symbolically under the rubble of the building with the burned bodies of the people that he had bombed. With the Americans, of course, it was the orange suits from Guantanamo, and it was all a theater of revenge, and we can do to you what you did to us. And in every one of those situations, they weren't going to trade or do something. They wanted to show fellow Arabs, these people have been persecuting us, we are going to get them, and we can do it. And we're the only people who can do it. All these other groups, they've failed, they're chaotic. And so I think that revenge aspect of it is very powerful.
Sir, that is it.